One thing that really struck me when I was in Guantanamo, and it was so bizarre going there, is just how much of a different moral universe it is. And I think it's important to understand that because that's what allows these sorts of policies of indefinite detention, torture, things that I think normal human beings would find repulsive. There it seems it's legitimized and normal.
Good evening and welcome everyone to Guantanamo and Us, the Ethics and Politics of Extraordinary Detention. My name is Eric Craig Sapp. I'm a member of Stanford Says No to War. We're hosting this event along with Christians, the Progressive Christians of Stanford. And we'd like to thank World Can't Wait, who is putting on the Closed Guantanamo Now tour, of which this event is one stop. I think they've been to New York, DC, and maybe Davis, or correct me if I'm wrong. The prison at Guantanamo has been open for 12 years now this month. That puts it almost as long as the concentration camp of Dachau before its liberation in 1933-1945. That might maybe sound like a hyperbolic comparison to compare Guantanamo to a concentration camp. But I think the standard definition of a detention camp is a bit too abstract for the ethical issues it raises. Another possible designation would be a penal colony. It's worth remembering that the colonial legacy of the Guantanamo base itself as an imperial outpost of the U.S. Will endure even if the prison is shut down. Andy Worthington, one of our speakers tonight, subtitled his book, The Guantanamo Files, referencing the illegal prison of Guantanamo. That's another way that one could describe this facility. But however you term it, there are now, I believe, 155 prisoners still remaining. Over 750 have passed through. None have received a fair trial, receiving basic standards of justice. The number of prisoners on hunger strike right now are in the double digits, although the data is hard to get on that. So it's an ongoing issue, and we're 5 years since President Obama declared that he would work to shut it down, and not much has happened on that front, although a few people have been released in recent weeks. I'm going to introduce Adam Hudson, and he'll introduce the other panelists. Adam Hudson, to my left, is a freelance journalist and Bay Area writer who covers war, peace, civil liberties, the Middle East, North Africa, and institutional racism. Last June, he spent 2 weeks covering Guantanamo, covering the military commission pretrial hearings of the alleged coal bomber and 9/11 plotters for the publication Truth Out. His work has appeared in The Nation, Truth Out, Alternate, Policy Mike, and other publications. Adam is also a Stanford alum and a co-founder of Stanford Says No to War. So I'll turn it over to Adam. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. So as Eric, I think, aptly alluded to, the Guantanamo Bay base itself has been there for well over 100 years. So I'm going to give a little bit of a historical background preceding the War on Terror to kind of give you guys an understanding of where this base comes from, and then I'll give some tidbits about what I saw there. Then I'll introduce our panelists, have them speak. Then I'll go deeper into what I reported, and then we'll kind of open it up for a discussion. So we'll kind of just basically go that way. So it's been 12 years since the Guantanamo Bay prison. Well, they call it a detention center. I think it's more apt to call it a prison because the actual facilities that are there are modeled after U.S. Supermax prison. So, I mean, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, you might as well call it that. So it's been open for 12 years, but the actual base itself has been there for over 100 years. And to give you some perspective, I kind of looked up the numbers on this. Guantanamo is 45 square miles. The Stanford University campus is about 12.78 square miles. So the actual base of Guantanamo is basically 4 times the size of Stanford, including land and water. And actual usable land area is probably about a third of that. So the actual base usable land is probably around the size of Stanford, if not much bigger. So that's just kind of give you a perspective how big this area is. So the actual history of Guantanamo goes back to the late 1800s. right around the time of the Spanish-American War. At that time, the U.S. Had pretty much, conquered through process of ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population up to, what we call California right now. So the United States already expanded, took over much of North America, but was looking to expand military and economically to other territories. And so it was looking at basically its neighbors to the south, like Mexico, Panama, and also Cuba, to gain access to markets and control over resources and to project military power. So the Spanish-American War and the decline of the Spanish Empire provided an opportunity for the U.S. to kind of push Spain out and assert itself. So the Spanish-American War began with the bombing of the USS Maine, which there are dubious reasons as to how that happened. But basically, right around 1898, we had captured Guantanamo Bay. And after the war ended, the U.S. signed a treaty with Cuba called the Platt Amendment. And in the Platt Amendment, it gave the U.S. the right to intervene to preserve Cuba's independence. And keep in mind, part of the calculus to intervene in Cuba was not really to free Cuba. The actual interest was to kick Spain out, but use that as an opportunity to reassert American control in Cuba. So it had little to do with what the Cuban people wanted. It basically what Washington wanted in Cuba. So hence why the Platt Amendment gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba to preserve its independence. I mean, that's kind of weird, right? Giving an outside nation the right to intervene in your country to preserve your own independence. But also in that amendment, it gave it said that Cuba has to give a base for coaling and naval purposes. And one of those bases was Guantanamo, and that was the original purpose, was basically for naval ships to refuel there. And so that's what gave us Guantanamo from that treaty. But another treaty came up in 1934, signed by Franklin Roosevelt, and it essentially made the Cuban lease to the U.S. government for the base essentially permanent. So the way the treaty worked out was that as long as there is no mutual agreement between the United States and Cuba to change the terms of the treaty, and as long as the U.S. is still using that base, then the U.S. still gets to keep the base at Guantanamo. So essentially that means that the lease to Guantanamo is permanent. We don't actually own it, but the Cuban government is leasing it out. And so that changes after 1959 with Castro coming to power in the Cuban Revolution. And the Cubans saying, look, this is the dagger into the heart of Cuba. Get this out of our country. The U.S. is like, well, no, we don't care. So what happened is, and this is how it is going into now, there's no, you cannot, when you're at the base, you cannot move freely between the base and the rest of Cuba. There's a combination of artificial and natural borders, really tall hills and mountains, disconnected roads, guard towers, barbed wire fences that kind of conveniently separate the base from the rest of Cuba. And so the U.S. forbade its troops from going to the rest of Cuba. And the U.S. still pays the Cuban government $4,000 a month as part of the lease to keep using the base, but as a form of protest, the Cuban government refuses to cash those checks, except for one time they accidentally cashed one of the checks. But, and then another time, they tried to cut off the water supply for the U.S. base. But the U.S. got around that by creating its own desalination plant on Guantanamo to basically create its own water from the water in the bay surrounding the base. And so, and there's also a large group of foreign workers there. They used to have Cuban workers at the base before the revolution. But after the revolution and basically the restriction of U.S. forces going between the base and the rest of Cuba, that cut off the flow of Cuban labor to the base. And so a lot of these workers, when you go there, when the soldiers stayed there, they need people to cook and clean and do a bunch of other stuff like sanitation, mow the lawn, kind of just, basic sort of labor. So since the Cubans were gone, they had what the U.S. did and still does is basically get workers from Jamaica and the Philippines to do that work, and they work for U.S. contractors. But this is actually a phenomenon that's at a lot of U.S. bases is that the U.S. Government will contract and subcontract out to get foreign workers to its U.S. bases. And it really what amounts to is a form of trafficking, essentially. And these workers are paid very, very little. Some of them work at bases in like Afghanistan and in Iraq. They get paid somewhere around like $150 to $500 a month, which is like less than $6,000 a year. And even if they're in war zones, if they get killed, no one hears about them because they're just the foreign workers that no one really hears about or cares about. So that's what's there. What I was covering there were two military commissions hearings, and I'll go into that after the panelists talk. But so the first one is for the alleged coal bomber, Abdul Rahim al-Nashri, and the other commission is for the alleged 5 9/11 plotters, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And so I was covering that, and those are the only cases that are actually being heard at this moment. And there have been only also a handful of convictions through these military commissions process. The rest, the overwhelming majority of people held in Guantanamo are not being charged with anything, and probably will not be charged with anything. And so to help make sense of this, I have my panel to the left, so I'll begin with Jeff. Jeffrey Kaye is a Bay Area psychologist and writer. He writes for Fire Dock Lake and The Public Record. Andy Worthington, to his left, is a journalist based in the UK. He's covered the Guantanamo prison intensely since 2006. In hundreds of articles, he's uncovered the lives of men held without charge and the stories of the U.S. created about them. He wrote the Guantanamo Files, stories of the 774 men held in Guantanamo, which there are copies of the book up there. And he's director of the 2009 film Outside the Law. He further developed the picture by sifting through Guantanamo detainee briefs released by WikiLeaks by Private Chelsea Manning in 2011. And next to Andy is Stephanie Tang, who I also kind of know personally. She's a leader in the movement World Can't Wait. From the Bush years till now, they've been on the front lines protesting and challenging indefinite detention, torture, and the really egregious war policies of the U.S. government during the War on Terror, including the May 2013 New York Times full-page ad that for the first time showed pictures of Guantanamo detainees bringing together prisoners, attorneys, academics, artists, and voices of conscience to declare close Guantanamo now. And Stephanie, she's a longtime activist, educator, and contributor to Revolution newspaper. So we'll start.
Well, hello, everybody. Glad to see you all here. Never been in Stanford before, so nice to be here. 12 years, eh? Who would have thought 12 years of Guantanamo? The fundamental thing about Guantanamo to remember is that this is a prison, that the reason that I called it an illegal prison is because there are only two acceptable ways for countries that claim to respect the rule of law to deprive people of their liberty. And one of those is that you arrest somebody, you charge them with a crime, and then you put them on trial in a court, a federal court. The other way is that you're at war and you pick people up off the battlefield and you imprison them unmolested until the end of hostilities in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. And the important thing to remember about Guantanamo, and I would think everybody here in this room knows it, but it's certainly not something that everybody in this nation knows or around the world, is that there was a third option that the Bush administration came up with, which was to hold people without any rights whatsoever so they could do whatever they wanted with them. And that's at the bottom of the problem that we've all had over all these years, that the Bush administration said, these are the worst of the worst guys. You know, they're responsible for 9/11. Trust us. Don't ask us any questions about them. We're looking after you. And far too many people took that at face value, whereas that should raise a lot of really thorny questions about are these the right people? How do you know they're the right people? What process are you actually using? Far too many people haven't bothered to interrogate the reasons why the Bush administration claimed that that was necessary. And I think that remains perilous for all of us when there is a situation in which the United States government claims that it can hold people without charge or trial. That situation was compounded by the fact that President Bush issued an executive order in February 2002 saying that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to the prisoners. that was a way of opening up the floodgates to the use of torture. And you know, these are the important milestones to remember in the Bush years. Are that the prisoners were held absolutely without rights until lawyers fighting for them managed to secure an important victory in the Supreme Court in June 2004, in which the Supreme Court said that the men had habeas corpus rights. That allowed lawyers into the prison. That punctuated the secrecy that was necessary to conduct a torture program at Guantanamo. The first attorneys arrived, I think, a handful of them in the fall of 2004, but from January 2005 onwards, attorneys started meeting the prisoners. Now, the Bush administration soon persuaded Congress to take away those habeas corpus rights, but the lawyers were still able to visit. It took until 2008, June 2008, another Supreme Court decision for the Supreme Court to say that Congress had acted unconstitutionally and to make sure that the prisoners had constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. The other important ruling that was made was in June 2006, the other important Supreme Court ruling, when they ruled that the military commission trial system was unconstitutional, and that the military commissions were subsequently revived by Congress. But the other thing that the Supreme Court did in June 2006 was to remind the Bush administration that if you're holding prisoners in whatever circumstances, you have to give them the protections of Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, which prohibits torture and other forms of abuse. So you think about it. From February the 7th, 2002, when President Bush issued an order saying that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, until June 2006 and that Supreme Court ruling, official policy of the United States was to torture people if the president wanted to, and that was happening at Guantanamo and elsewhere. Shortly after that ruling, in September 2006, 14 guys who had been held in CIA black sites, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abdul Rahim al-Nashiri, Abu Zubaydah, who was the first official torture victim of the War on Terror. 14 of these guys arrived from the black sites, and President Bush declared that the black sites were closed. In fact, what he did was he stood in the Rose Garden and said, up until now, we've always said that they didn't exist. Now I'm going to acknowledge that they do exist, but now I'm going to tell you that we're closing them down, all very, very quickly. President Bush started receiving a lot of flack in his second term, and he responded to that by releasing a lot of prisoners from Guantanamo. By the time President Obama became the president, there were 240 men left at Guantanamo. He famously promised to close the prison within a year on his second day in office, and of course he failed to do that. What he did was set up a task force, a high-level interagency task force of around 60 government officials and representatives of the intelligence agencies who met once a week and went through the files of all the prisoners at Guantanamo. In January 2010, they issued their report recommending the disposition of those prisoners, whether they should be freed, whether they should be prosecuted, whether they should continue to be held without charge or trial. The breakdown of the numbers on that was that they recommended 156 men to be released. They recommended 36 men for prosecution, and they recommended 48 for ongoing detention without charge or trial. That latter category ought to be alarming to everybody. This was obviously the official policy of the Bush administration, but under President Obama, he could claim with respect to everything else that he had inherited these difficult issues from the Bush administration. But in personally issuing an executive order in March 2011, as he did, to authorize the detention of these 48 men to be held, to continue to be held without charge or trial, he is responsible with that order for being a president who has authorized the indefinite detention of prisoners without charge or trial. Now, he tried to get around that by saying that there would be periodic review boards of these men's status to ascertain whether they were regarded as much dangerous to release as they were when those decisions were made. You know, that was supposed to be a process that took place quite quickly, but all the agencies involved in the administration dragged their feet, and the first of those hearings didn't take place until November. That's 2 months ago, November. So from March 2011 to November 2013, that's the amount of time that it took for the periodic review boards to convene. It involved a prisoner spending 6 hours by video link talking to the panel who were on the US mainland, explaining why he would very much like to be released from Guantanamo, and they have exaggerated his significance. And then we didn't hear anything about it in any detail because we haven't had an unclassified transcript or anything. But just very recently, we received the good news on the surface, at least, that this man passed the test. He has been cleared for release as a result of his periodic review board. So of the 155 men, there are a handful that will face trial. 70 more are supposed to go through this periodic review process. The rest of the prisoners were cleared for release. And of those 156 that were cleared for release initially, there are now 76 left, 77 with the one who just won his PRB. So what we've had under Obama is that, in the first few years, he released dozens of prisoners. He released nearly 70 men, I think. A number of these men had to be resettled in third countries because it wasn't safe for them to return home. At no point did the Obama administration countenance the arrival of any of these men on the United States mainland to live here, the country that had been responsible for depriving them of so many years of their lives. Other countries had to do that. Obama, the courts, and the judiciary have all made it clear that they don't want any former Guantanamo prisoner coming to the US mainland to be resettled, or for any reason, to be honest. After this, President Obama increasingly faced obstacles in Congress. Congress refused to allow him to move the prisoners to the US mainland to a facility here so that he could close the prison at Guantanamo. Emboldened, really, by the ease with which they were able to put the frighteners on the president, lawmakers continued to impose new restrictions. For the last few years, very few prisoners were released from Guantanamo. Between September 2010 and August 2013, just 5 men, a 3-year period, just 5 men were released from Guantanamo. Congress had said to the president, if you want to release anyone from Guantanamo, here are a series of hoops that you have to jump through, very visibly and noticeably in front of us. You need to jump through these hoops. We want you to certify to us that if you're going to release a prisoner, they will not be able to engage in terrorism subsequently against the United States. That's, as far as I see, they called it onerous. I call that impossible as a requirement. Now, poor President Obama, just the President of the United States, hands tied by Congress, what could he do? Well, it turns out that President Obama throughout had a waiver that was written into the legislation which allowed him to bypass Congress if he regarded it as being in the national security interest of the United States. And guess what? Every time President Obama speaks about Guantanamo, he very eloquently and persuasively and convincingly explains why the continued existence of the prison is not in the national security interests of the United States. So, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but it's down to you. You could not be bothered to spend the political capital overcoming the obstacles that were raised by Congress. That's where we were up until last year. Then the prisoners embarked on a huge prison-wide hunger strike. Everybody in the world woke up to it. It was as if in newsrooms around the world, everybody got an A4 memo that had been written by all of us campaigners on the 10th anniversary saying, don't forget how evil this place is. What a moral, legal, and ethical abomination it is. And I'm very grateful that the world's media woke up to the outrage of it, because they helped to put pressure on President Obama. 1 million people last year signed up to petitions calling for the closure of Guantanamo. In the years before, you'd have been lucky to get 5,000. 1 million people signed those. The European Parliament put pressure on President Obama. The United Nations put pressure on President Obama. In May, he delivered a major speech on national security. He promised to resume releasing prisoners. He promised to appoint envoys to deal with the release of prisoners and move towards the closure of Guantanamo. And he dropped his ban on releasing Yemenis. Now, of the 77 now cleared prisoners, 55 of those men are Yemenis. Only one Yemeni has been released since December 2009. And what happened was that roughly at the same time that the task force issued its recommendations of who was cleared for release with these 55 Yemenis, a Nigerian man tried and failed to blow up a bomb in his underwear on a plane bound for Detroit at Christmas Day 2009. He was recruited in Yemen. The backlash was such that President Obama imposed a ban, and of course, as I've said, Congress has imposed these ridiculous bans on releasing anybody. But Obama had his own ban on releasing prisoners. He only dropped that in May, but he still hasn't released any Yemenis. So the thing we need to be able to do, if we care about it this year, is to keep talking about the Yemenis and get these guys sent home. But he has actually done something. Not a lot, but he has done something if you think about the total paralysis of the last 3 years and him sitting on his hands resolutely and only releasing 5 people. He's released 11 people since he delivered that speech in May. And he has appointed the envoys to help him deal with things, which I think means that you know, on a day-to-day basis, these are the guys who are talking to other countries, talking to the men's home countries when they can be sent home to try and sort out these arrangements. It's a man called Paul Lewis in the Pentagon. It's a man called Cliff Sloan in the State Department. I don't really think either of these veteran diplomats took the job on the basis that that they would fail. I think they have the intent to do what they can. So we're in a good position now, a better position than we've been in for years, to push on this issue. Send those cleared prisoners home. That's it. Let's get those guys home, and while we're talking about it, we all need to be aware that the rest of these guys need justice. So we have these periodic review boards. Get on with them. Find as many people as you can not detainable any longer, because the only people that should be being detained and who should be tried in a reputable venue are the people genuinely accused of acts of terrorism. And there are very few of those people at Guantanamo. In fact, when the chief prosecutor spoke about this last June, the administration has had some defeats in that a few of the results they achieved in the military commissions were overthrown by the conservative Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., because they tried and convicted them for invented war crimes invented by Congress. And the conservative judges saw that and wouldn't allow it. The chief prosecutor said, of the people held at Guantanamo, we think that a maximum of 20 will ever be subject to these trials. They've already had 7 of them. That means just 13 of the people that are held there. The rest of them, there's never been any justification for any of these people to be held in the manner in which they've been held. I hope you all recall what I said at the beginning about the justifications for depriving people of their liberty. But there is no justification. And if they were holding people in some kind of world in which they were taking people off the battlefield and holding them until the end of hostilities, which is true, although they did it through the authorization for use of military force and not through the Geneva Conventions. And the Bush administration loved to say that this was an intergenerational war without any time or geographical limits that was going to go on forever. Well, okay, but actually there's going to be a drawdown of troops from Afghanistan at the end of this year, and that provides the end of the justification for holding people seized in connection with the conflict, so we can push on that as well. But that's the situation we're in. Let's push to release the prisoners and keep pushing to get the prison closed. The main thing we need to know about that is that Congress, although Congress eased its restrictions on releasing prisoners in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, just passed, it refused. The House had to negotiate with the Senate. The Senate came up with this much more useful version of the bill. What the Senate wanted as well was to allow the president to bring prisoners to the U.S. mainland, to be tried, to be detained, to receive emergency medical treatment. If he can bring them here, he can close Guantanamo. We will then get new legal challenges about these men being held here. But the House refused that. They allowed the easing of restrictions, but they absolutely refused to allow him to bring prisoners to the U.S. mainland. We need to say, you need to say, I'm not American. You need to say as Americans to the president, you overcome these obstacles. We don't care how you do it. You do this by executive order, or you do this by getting Congress again to agree. These men must be brought here so that we can close the prison once and for all. Those, I think, are the big issues. I'm sorry if I went on a bit there, but thank you.
I want to thank, actually, Stanford Says No to War and World Can't Wait for putting on this event and inviting us here. Thank you very much. I want to go back to a moment in your narrative, Andy. September 2006. Perhaps I was still a young man then, and perhaps some of you can remember back 7.5 years ago almost. And I remember that I was very excited. I was still in my training as a psychologist, and I had met the previous year with my first torture victim at, of all places, in City College of San Francisco. And it was quite a surprise, and no one really knew of my supervisors what to say about it or what to do about working with a torture victim. And it was a very powerful experience for me. and I became much more attuned to the issue of torture, which was then in the press, particularly after Abu Ghraib and onward. And it was with some interest that I noticed in September 2006, at the same time that Bush had taken the so-called high-value detainees and brought them back from the CIA black sites to Guantanamo, that on the same day that Bush had that press conference, the Pentagon introduced a brand new Army field manual for interrogation, which was touted in the New York Times and the LA Times and the press in general as a new humane source for interrogation. Torture was now over. The United States didn't believe in torture, and the Army field manual would become the new, as Senator Feinstein put it at one point, golden, gold standard, thank you, for interrogation. So I sat down because I like to read documents, I don't know why, and thought I would read the Army field manual, and it was with horror that I saw that, in fact, despite what the press had said, the Army field manual, in fact, allowed torture. I felt like I was going insane because everyone else was telling me that this was a humane and new document. And I'm reading, particularly in the part of the Army field manual at the end of a special appendix, Appendix M, as in Mary, that for prisoners who were not subject to Geneva POW protections, i.e. for all the prisoners at Guantanamo or any of the so-called war on terror sites, which Bush and Cheney had denied POW protections, that these special techniques would apply. And these techniques included the use of isolation or solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, the manipulation of the environment and diet. And as well, in the main text of the Army field manual, they had made changes so that there was a wider latitude for the type of drugs that could be used on detainees. And they had eliminated language against sleep deprivation and stress positions that had previously been in the Army field manual. In fact, from as much as I knew about the history of torture, they had, in fact, brought into the Army field manual the primary coercive doctrine of the CIA's old QBARC manual, which was in the 60s, which in fact before the enhanced interrogation techniques was the primary method of torture that the CIA endorsed, which was based on, based on sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and isolation, or as they, as the psychologists who worked on it called it, the 3 Ds: debility, dread, and dependency. Debility is, of course, they would weaken you by all sorts of different means. Dread is they would make you more frightened than you'd ever felt in your life. And then you would be dependent upon your interrogator, who in fact would be like your God, an omnipotent God. And they sought to implement these techniques. They were doing it before 2006 at Guantanamo. In fact, when the Senate Armed Services Committee investigated prisoner abuse at the Department of Defense, concentrating not just on Guantanamo, but also Iraq and Afghanistan, nevertheless, in the portion of their report, which was released, I think, in 2008, the head of the intelligence division of the Army emails were released that showed that they were calling Guantanamo in the early days the battle lab in the war on terror. And in fact, the men who came from the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency's SEER program were quite explicit in saying this was an experiment to reverse engineer the types of techniques that were used to inoculate or teach U.S. prisoners of war how to survive torture were in fact now going to be used to torture prisoners of the United States. In fact, we have here tonight a surprise for you. A man who knows a great deal about this is sitting in the first row, and I was wondering if you might want to just say a few words about SEER, and because this man knew one of the men, Bruce Jessen, who was involved in the construction of the U.S. torture program at that time for the CIA, and maybe you want to talk about this omnipotent control.
Has anyone, everyone knows the game Clue? You know, it's Colonel Mustard with the candlestick. Jeff Kaye is my Clue game. He's my hero. You know, I spent 7 years as a SEER instructor. I'm kind of one of the fortunate people because I was injured in Operation Desert Storm, so I was retired on a disability in 1991. I went off and did my civil service work, and as a retired intelligence officer, worked again as an intelligence officer overseas for the Australian government just before 9/11. And after 9/11, I was asked, could you please, ex-SEER instructor from the United States, could you please help us with our Special Forces guys, you know, the SAS, to give them SEER training for them if they get caught when they're working with your Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. Because SEER school, and I've been through many levels of SEER training since coming into intelligence in 1977. But the most shocking moment was when you find out it's not Colonel Mustard with a candlestick. No, it's guys named Bruce Jessen and Jim Mitchell and Roger Aldridge, who you've spent intimate years working with, who were the ones who Jeff Kaye found were the ones who were behind the entire torture program and creating, which is the antithesis of what we taught. And I just happened to have found, because I called Jeff. Actually, I didn't call you right away. We spoke, and Physicians for Human Rights were involved, and the New York Times was all excited about this story, and it went nowhere. However, I said to my girlfriend, I have a pretty good recollection of things. I always, as an intelligence guy, try and keep copies, of course, unclassified copies of things. And I said to my girlfriend, I think I have the original notes from Bruce Jessen, because we sat down and wrote the course that we gave to JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, that works with the Central Intelligence Agency to go and do this war against terror. And those personal handwritten notes by Bruce Jessen I happen to have in my possession, which I made lots of copies and sent it to all my friends in intelligence. One fellow I talked to was a retired Major General who worked on the National Security Council. I called him up. I said, hey, Rosie, guess what I found? Oh, gosh. He says, don't ever talk to me about this issue ever again, and I don't want you to send me any more information through the email, and I'm getting this off of my server. That's kind of my psychoses, is to realize that training people for the potential detention by hostile forces who don't have a care about Geneva Conventions is exactly what we became.
I want to note that, thanks Michael, that Michael did give a copy of those notes to Jason Leopold and myself. And an article was written in Truth Out now, I guess a couple of years ago, and those notes are available online, not hard to find, I think. And again, what they emphasize is how you can use the kinds of techniques we're talking about to, as Justin himself put it, create a dependency in the prisoner and therefore total control. Because that's what Guantanamo is about. It's about creating an environment of total control. And and how to do that and to fine-tune it, these people experiment on the detainees. And it's my personal belief, and I can't prove it, of course, that the reason they don't want to let these people go, or why they want to destroy them as much as possible before they do, is so that they don't talk. Because I'll tell you one thing I do know from working with torture victims, is that when you come out of severe torture, you don't want to talk about it ever again. And that means you've got people who aren't going to talk about the crimes that took place. And that's what, so that's why today, under Obama, with beatings in the cells, the so-called forced cell extractions, the continued use of indefinite detention, you don't know what's going to happen, which also breaks you down, which is a great report Physicians for Human Rights did in 2010 about the health effects of indefinite detention. And God knows what else is still going on. Apparently sleep deprivation still goes on there, and use of drugs, which I found out through a Inspector General's report that I did a FOIA on, that showed that, in fact, forced use of drugs on prisoners does, in fact, take place at Guantanamo. It's just supposedly not during interrogations. But, of course, that didn't go much of anywhere. So, anyway, I think I probably inundated you with the idea of torture. So just a little bit you might feel listening to this, imagine living it. That's what the people, of course, are doing in Guantanamo even today as we speak. So yeah, do we need to close it down? We needed to close it down long ago.
I want to thank Stanford Students Against the War for putting this on, and the Progressive Christian Students Group, I guess, the other group, and also for making sure that we could create videotape of this program so that other people who aren't here today can actually hear what is said here and participate in the movement to stop this torture and close Guantanamo. Given what we know about the story of Guantanamo, which I'm not going to repeat here, there is really only one good solution, only one, and that is that the people of this country and the world, but especially the people of this country, have to demand that this hellhole, this illegal torture camp, be shut down, not in 5 or 10 years, but now. Now. And to demand that all of these atrocities end, including the indefinite detention, by the United States. And I'll just speak very briefly, if I can, to 2 questions as to why that matters. The first question is, why did they open Guantanamo in the first place, where they opened it? The second question is, why is it still open, given everything that we know through the work of very courageous, truthful journalists, truthful advocates, and even sometimes the other press? We know too much to say that it's not clear. It is clear. Right? This is an atrocity. So why is it still open? Okay, first of all, I think some people in this room are old enough and other people are not old enough to remember 2001, some of the things we saw. One thing we saw was massive sweeps of men who looked Muslim off the streets from Brooklyn to Karachi. And they were disappeared, and they were tortured, and they were detained, and we did see that. The thing we didn't see at that time was this very hastily thrown up network of secret U.S. prisons run by the CIA, the black sites that have been mentioned. And these were all over across Eastern Europe and Asia and the Middle East, and there were these CIA ghost planes. CIA, in my book, stands for cold-blooded imperialist assassins. They were transporting, rendering people from dozens of countries to other countries where they could be tortured and imprisoned and disappeared. And we didn't see that at the time, but we know it now. This was the war that Cheney said, remember, would last generations. And this was the war in which Cheney said, we have to be ready to go to the dark side, right? And this is the war that was going to go on by any means necessary. And less than 4 months after 9/11, Guantanamo was opened. The worst of the worst were sent there, the first 20 on January 11th, 12 years ago, when some of you were in the 4th grade. And some of the worst were 13 to 15 years old at that time. They grew up in Guantanamo. They grew up under torture. So thanks to Chelsea Manning, who leaked the Guantanamo detainee assessment briefs, and thanks to Andy Worthington, who analyzed them, the world knows that very few of these people, like has been said, the U.S. had no business picking these people up, and it certainly had no business holding these people for 12 years without any justice. So, but why at Guantanamo is really simple, because the Bush-Cheney people said this place is in Cuba, it's outside U.S. jurisdiction, therefore none of these laws, none of these norms that apply to the treatment of prisoners or prisoners of war will apply. We can do anything we want to these people, as Andy said. And why? Guantanamo, again, look, it was very secretive, all the other stuff. Bagram, the many more people who were tortured there, murdered there, we don't know their names. All of this stuff was secret elsewhere, but they needed one place to show the world that they were going to do this. And one place where they could say, not just to the prisoners, but to the people of the world, we can do anything we want, and that includes torture, and that includes murder. In fact, the CIA operatives nicknamed it Strawberry Fields. Do you remember the Beatles? Right, Strawberry Fields, forever, right? That's how long they were to be held. few years ago, World Can't Wait was at a high school in inner city Chicago. We were speaking about Guantanamo. And the teacher asked the kids, hey, why do you think Bush opened Guantanamo? And this kid raises his hand in the back of the room and he says, lynching. The teacher said, what do you mean? And the kid says, well, look, you know, in the South, when black people were lynched, it wasn't just something that one person had done. It was to terrorize the whole community and keep the Jim Crow system in place. And this wise young man, who himself lives sort of in the epicenter of mass incarceration, where the US is the world's #1 jailer, he's telling us the essence of Guantanamo. It's to terrorize people, to send a message to the entire world. So it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't Bush crazily going too far, and it can't be mended or reformed. The very name has come to mean torture, unjust detention, brutality, and inhumane degradation. And some people who run this country, they like that. They think it's good. And some people, maybe like Obama, maybe they don't like it so much. Maybe they think it's embarrassing. It's like not quite with the picture of multicultural imperialism these days. But Guantanamo is a system problem. It's not a politician problem. Question number 2, why is it still open? As Andy and other truthful people and legal and human rights advocates have revealed in such factual detail, this is such an atrocity. Why is it still open? It's not enough to blame Obama. The US government is keeping this prison open. And why? Well, the US is a world power, and it has necessities, and it has ambitions and interests. They're not the same as your interests or my interests, but it has interests, and those interests demand the extension of American power in the world. It's a capitalist, imperialist globalization that massively exploits billions of people around the world. And that is what the huge military is for. That's what this mirage of democracy covers for. And so controlling the Middle East and that wider region and keeping other powers from controlling it is really crucial to their strategic interests. And now they've got this instability in the Middle East. They've got this rise of Islamic fundamentalist forces that pose a threat to the US agenda, right? And this is an ideology that puts itself forward as an antidote or an opposition to the US and to Western domination and its form of democracy. And these Islamic political forces, in my opinion, are completely reactionary, and they don't represent anything good for the people. They represent both feudal and more modern bourgeois oppression, and they do not oppose foreign capital in their countries. And they're horrible for the people, especially the women. But they clash in some ways, in real ways, with the US interests and those of its regional clients. And so, just to be clear where I'm coming from, the US, these Islamic fundamentalists, there's no contest about who's done worse things in the world. It's the US. I mean, it's hands down, you know. There are little 911s every week in the region. There are drone strikes every day. You know, there's the destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 whole beautiful countries full of people, human beings, and their countries have been destroyed. And now the wars are spreading. Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, Africa. It's, in my opinion, it's all illegitimate, it's immoral, and it's got to stop. And it's part of this that Guantanamo provides a source for the US to keep it going. And thank you, Edward Snowden, for showing us that this program of terrorizing the globe is backed up by surveilling the entire globe so that they can keep track of who doesn't like it. As for Obama's promise, maybe it was genuine, but he has been fine with ordering the targeted killings. And maybe one reason he ignored Guantanamo until the hunger strike forced it is best explained by John Bellinger, the Bush official and himself war criminal who helped design the drone program. Bellinger recently said the American government has decided that instead of detaining members of al-Qaeda at Guantanamo, they're just going to kill them. And therefore the drone strikes, and therefore the thousands of civilians, including many children who have died. So I'll try to be quick. The other reason maybe they haven't closed Guantanamo is that they haven't had to. World Can't Wait directs our movement's efforts not at gaining a better ear from the president or the political powers that be. We see that it is sometimes possible, we see it in history, sometimes it's possible to force the U.S. government to back down. But what it takes is the resounding outrage of millions of people across society expressed in political demands, political movements, in struggle and independent political action. And that is what we need from the people of this country. And that is what our movement is out to mobilize. Redoubled, very dynamic, loud efforts of people demanding that all the cleared prisoners be released immediately, and that all the men who the government says it's not going to charge, try, or release must be charged, given fair trials, or released. In the World Can't Wait, people have different political and philosophical views. For me, I encourage you to take a look at something called the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America, draft proposal. And it comes from Bob Avakian's party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, and it's a vision of a very different society. And on page 74, there's a very simple principle, and it means it. Cruel and unusual punishment, including torture, shall be prohibited. This is a very long section on the rights of the people and protections against, abuses by the state, and you can read it for yourself. And Larry Everest is here, and he's a very staunch advocate for the philosophy and the politics behind this book. But I'll finish by saying the system we have today, a lot of students have told us, you're kind of cynical because you don't know the world before Bush, before the war on terror. People have told us, no, all societies torture. There's nothing we can do. It's not true. There can be a world in which such abuses are done away with, and we unite with all kinds of people who want to bring that about. And focusing on Guantanamo once more, the prisoners are calling on us. That hunger strike is speaking to us, and it's saying we need the truth to come out about what we are going through, why it's happened, and please, we need you to hear us and then actually live with that and act on it, and we will work with people who are former participants in the U.S. military who have seen what is actually happening and have broken with the torture state. We will unite with revolutionaries who are trying to bring in a different world. We love to unite with people who are too young to remember when it was any different, because you are the ones who are actually going to help carry forward till we actually get to a different world. And finally, I just want to shout out to the prisoners locked up in the American Gulag who are very conscious of what's happening in Guantanamo and see them, the Guantanamo men, as their brothers, and are crying out, 80,000 in solitary confinement in this country. Guantanamo over there. We live here. Silence is complicity. American lives are not more important than the lives of other people. And please join with us. The world does not have to be like this. It can be different, but it's up to us. Thank you.
One thing that really struck me when I was in Guantanamo, and it was so bizarre going there, is just how much of a different moral universe it is. And I think it's important to understand that because that's what allows these sorts of policies of indefinite detention, torture, things that I think normal human beings would find repulsive. There it seems it's legitimized and normal. The phrase banality of evil really kind of I think sums up Guantanamo. Because the Convention Against Torture and basic international law, customary international law, that bans and binds all states, bans torture, they said that confers no rights to the accused in these military commissions. And the reason why is because when the United States signed the Convention Against Torture, when it ratified the treaty in the U.S. Senate, they put these various signing statements, these memorandums of understanding, which basically gutted the teeth of the convention itself. And so the judge said that, well, because the Senate ratification said the treaty is non-self-executing, it confers no rights in this military commission. And the defense attorneys are like, well, you just can't throw international law down the toilet like that, basically, which is essentially what the U.S. government is doing in these military commissions, saying like, okay, we have the right to prosecute these guys for these heinous acts of terrorism, but anything that, all the torture and the black site stuff, we're throwing that out. And not only that, but the people who authorize and implement those policies escape any form of accountability whatsoever, including, one of the professors here at Stanford University, Condoleezza Rice. I mean, she may be a professor here and lauded by academics here, but as a Stanford alum, I think it's very disgusting that a university would welcome her in this place, and instead of her being held accountable, in the justice system. And but what makes Guantanamo bad are the policies, and that's what we got to focus on. It's not just the location, but the policies. The policies in Guantanamo exist because Guantanamo as a location makes it easy for the U.S. government to detain people and torture them without the prying eyes of human rights organizations and the press. That's why it was kept in Guantanamo. But you still have, a secret prison in Somalia run by the CIA. They're still tortured by the CIA and JSOC and their Afghan proxies in Afghanistan, which will probably continue well after conventional U.S. forces leave this year. And Obama signed the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act that allows for the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. So if the indefinite detention of non-American citizens, which is still abhorrent, if that doesn't scare anyone, well, imagine you, an American citizen, being indefinitely detained by your own government. I think that's a slap in the face to our basic human rights, and that's been continuing under Obama. These military commissions, indefinite detention, torture, still continue. And that's all under the rubric of the perpetual war on terror. As long as we have this never-ending perpetual war on terror, which shows no signs of abating, even after we leave Afghanistan, we're just basically attacking more countries. As long as that perpetual war continues, these policies are going to continue. So I think to kind of understand Guantanamo, it's not just the location. Guantanamo, I think, is a symbol of perpetual war, indefinite detention, and torture. Guantanamo, it's not just the location. It's a symbol of perpetual war, indefinite detention, and torture.